was the kind of golden afternoon that made one feel as though the world had forgotten how to be unkind. The annual St. Mary Mead summer garden party, held in the vicarage's shaded lawn, was in full swing, complete with bunting fluttering, gently in the breeze, sponge cakes on doilies, and children shrieking with delight near the lemonade stand. Elderly ladies, clutching parasols and fans, nibbled on cucumber sandwiches, while young women in floral frocks danced attendance on gentlemen recently returned from London. Miss Marple, pink-cheeked and precise in her lilac dress and straw hat, sat quietly under the shade of a sycamore tree, knitting a baby bonnet in white wool. Her needles clicked gently, unnoticed by most, though her eyes missed little. "It's strange, don't you think?" whispered Mrs. Petherick, the vicar's wife, settling onto the bench beside her. "So soon after poor Leonard passed, and yet she's as radiant as ever." Miss Marple did not need to look up to know who she was. Gwendolen Simmons, now Mrs. Gwendolen Cargill, stood by the rose trellis, all in cornflower blue, not a trace of mourning black to be seen. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her face lightly powdered, and her laughter as bright as her silk scarf. Gwendolen had married Leonard Cargill, a local solicitor 20 years her senior, just 2 years prior. He died suddenly only 3 weeks. Ago, heart failure, the doctor said, though some had murmured it came too swiftly. And now, instead of discreet weeping and half-veiled glances, Gwendolen smiled as though widows were expected to sparkle. Miss Marple glanced over her spectacles. "Some women grieve in ways that aren't always visible," she said gently, though her needles paused for just a moment. "And others," she added, "don't grieve at all." "She claims he wanted no black," Mrs. Petherick went on, lowering her voice. "Said it would darken the lilies. She brought those lilies, mind you, to church the very day after his funeral. White lilies with gold trim, most inappropriate." Across the lawn, the vicar clinked his glass and called for silence to announce the winners of the annual jam competition. A cheer went up for Mrs. Hinchley's damson preserve, though some muttered it was clearly store-bought. Gwendolen Cargill applauded politely, then turned toward the refreshment table. A young man, Arthur Dilling, the new assistant at the estate, agency, leapt to pour her a cup of elderflower cordial. His attentiveness was conspicuous. "She doesn't waste time," Mrs. Petherick noted with a sniff. "Do you think they were acquainted before Leonard passed?" Miss Marple gave a small shake of her head, not in denial, but in polite non-commitment. "People behave oddly when they're lonely," she said, "or when they think no one is watching." But Miss Marple had watched. She had seen Gwendolen press a handkerchief to her eyes in church with no visible tears, had noted her hasty return to the solicitor's office just days after the funeral, and now she noted, though no one else seemed to, that her handbag left absent-mindedly on a bench had a blood-red stain near the clasp. Just a smudge, but too dark for lipstick. As the party went on and the sun dipped behind the trees, a commotion stirred near the potting shed. Young George Hemmings came running, face pale as milk. "There's a body," he cried, "in the shed." "It's Mr. Taverner. He's dead." Gasps spread like wildfire. Teacups clattered. Mrs. Petherick gripped Miss Marple's arm. "Oh dear," murmured Miss Marple softly, folding her knitting. "Not again." She rose, brushing imaginary crumbs from her lap, and made her way with steady purpose toward the growing crowd, eyes calm, lips pursed, her mind already at work. The summer garden party, it seemed, was no longer about jam and bunting. It was about death. And Miss Marple knew without question that the death of Mr. Taverner and the widow who refused to wear black were somehow inevitably linked. Miss Marple reached the potting shed with the quiet urgency of someone who knew better than to interfere but also knew better than to be far away. The crowd had formed a haphazard semicircle just outside the door, murmuring like pigeons at dusk. Young George Hemmings, still pale and wide-eyed, stood clutching his mother's hand, and the vicar was gently trying to shepherd people back, all while peering inside with an expression that blended shock with reluctant curiosity. Inside the shed, the late Mr. Taverner lay sprawled beside an overturned bag of fertilizer, one arm extended toward a dusty wooden shelf stacked with clay pots. His eyes were open, but utterly lifeless, and his mouth was slightly ajar as though he had been about to say something. His shirt was stained near the collar with something dark. Miss Marple noted the position of the body, the absence of any gardening tools nearby, and the disarray not of the shed itself, but of the man's expression. It was not surprise or pain she saw frozen there. It was recognition. Dr. Partridge had already been summoned. He arrived still in his dinner jacket, having been fetched directly from his niece's recital. He bent down, muttered a few things to the vicar, and finally straightened up, brushing his hands down his trousers with unnecessary thoroughness. "Dead quite some hours, I should think," he said. "Blow to the head, blunt instrument most likely. I'd wager he was dead by noon, perhaps earlier." Gasps followed like thunder after lightning. That would mean Mr. Taverner had been lying dead here during the entire garden party, just a few yards from the bunting and baked scones. "I'll ring Inspector Craddock," said the vicar gravely. "It's best not to speculate further until he arrives." Miss Marple, who had said nothing up to this point, quietly turned her gaze from the body to the crowd. She looked not at the obvious suspects or those making a great show of concern, but rather at who seemed too calm, too rehearsed in their reactions. Gwendolen Cargill stood a few feet away, clutching her handbag, the same one Miss Marple had noticed earlier. Her face was drawn into a mask of genteel distress, but her eyes darted quickly toward the shed and then to Arthur Dilling, who stood rooted, fists clenched at his sides. "He was always poking about where he wasn't wanted," muttered old Mr. Sims, the village carpenter. "Taverner knew everyone's business. Used to keep notebooks, I heard. Blackmail, more likely than not." "Really, Mr. Sims," Mrs. Petherick gasped. "That's a dreadful thing to say." "Dreadful. Or not, it may be true," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "People who collect secrets sometimes forget how heavy they become." No one asked her what she meant, which suited her fine. Inspector Craddock arrived just after sunset, accompanied by Constable Reed, who looked uncharacteristically alert. Craddock was a tall man with a direct manner and a dry wit that hid a genuine respect for order. He took Miss Marple's presence in stride, as he always did, greeting her with a polite nod before setting about cordoning off the scene. "Tell me what you saw, Miss Marple," he said quietly once the crowd had been ushered away. "Oh, nothing really. Only the aftermath. But I've been observing all day, as I always do. People talk quite freely when they think they are only being offered another cup of tea," he smiled faintly. "Any reason to believe Mr. Taverner had enemies?" "Everyone has enemies, Inspector, but not all of them are inclined to violence. The question is, who had reason to act on their enmity today?" Craddock made a note in his pocketbook. "And that widow, Mrs. Cargill, how did she react?" "She reacted beautifully," Miss Marple replied, with a slight arch to her brow. "Too beautifully, perhaps." Craddock followed her gaze across the lawn. Gwendolen was speaking now with Mrs. Redpath, the local grocer's wife, accepting sympathy, with quiet nods. Arthur Dilling stood nearby, awkward and silent, as if unsure whether to stay or flee. Later that evening, with the party disbanded and the village once again wrapped in a deceptive calm, Craddock called upon Miss Marple at her cottage. Tea had already been prepared, with a plate of shortbread biscuits on the table and the fire crackling faintly in the hearth. "You believe the murder was personal?" he said without preamble. Miss Marple poured the tea slowly. "All murders are personal, dear boy. It is the act of ending a life, not simply to erase it, but often to correct a perceived wrong. or to silence something one cannot bear to hear. Craddock took a biscuit. You think Mr. Taverner was going to reveal something? I think, she said softly, that Mr. Taverner had already done so. Craddock frowned. Explain. He had an argument this morning with someone. I saw them from the window as I was trimming my roses. He was speaking rather animatedly to Gwendolen Cargill outside the post office. She was flushed. She said something, he turned away. Whatever it was, it upset them both. I'll need to speak with her again. Yes, but not yet. Let her settle. She is clever in her way. But cleverness, born of fear, rarely holds up under a long conversation. Craddock rose. And Arthur Dilling? Miss Marple sipped her tea. Ah, yes, the young man. He is angry, not at the death, but at the complication of it. His frustration stems from being drawn into something he cannot control. You think he's in love with Mrs. Cargill? I think he believes he is. Whether she returns the sentiment is ambiguous. Craddock pocketed his notebook. Well, I'll talk to both of them tomorrow. As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple stood and returned to her knitting basket. But instead of the baby bonnet, she lifted out an envelope she had found earlier, beneath the hedge near the potting shed. It was unsealed, damp from the grass, and the name scrawled on it was unmistakable. Leonard. She did not open it. Not yet. But her hands were steady as ever. The mystery, like her knitting, was beginning to take shape. Loops and threads, twists and slips. And at the center of it all, a widow who never wore black, a man who may have known too much, and the quiet recognition in the eyes of a dead man. The following morning dawned grey and heavy with the promise of rain, casting a muted light over St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were reluctant to greet the new day. Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts circling the events of the previous evening, like the restless mist curling through the hedgerows. She prepared her breakfast with the same deliberate calm she applied to all things, the clinking of teaspoons and the soft rustle of newspaper pages marking the start of another day that would be anything but ordinary. Before the post was delivered, a knock came at her door. It was Mrs. Dolly Bantry, flushed from a brisk walk and carrying a bundle of freshly picked wildflowers. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said warmly, stepping inside with the easy familiarity of old friendship. "I thought you might like these. They're from the meadow behind the church." Miss Marple smiled, taking the flowers and placing them in a small vase by the window. "Thank you, Dolly, it's kind of you." "Any news about that poor Mr. Taverner?" Dolly asked, sinking into the armchair by the fire. "I hear Inspector Craddock has been asking questions all over the village." "Yes, Miss Marple," replied, settling into her own chair. "He's been busy, and so have I, in my own way." As the morning wore on, the post arrived, bringing with it a letter from Inspector Craddock. It was brief, noting that he planned to interview several villagers that day, including Mrs. Cargill and Arthur Dilling, and asking if Miss Marple might be available to share any observations. Later, as the sky darkened and the threat of rain edged closer, Miss Marple walked to the village shop, where the hum of gossip was already gathering. She overheard whispers of suspicion and fear, the kind that in a small village grew faster than the ivy on the church walls. She found Mrs. Petherick arranging shelves of jam jars and offered a gentle greeting. "Good morning, Mrs. Petherick. Have you seen much of Gwendolen this morning?" Mrs. Petherick's eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin. "She's been rather elusive, but she was seen talking to the vicar at length just after dawn. Some say she's putting on a brave face, but I think she's more calculating than that." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then noticed Arthur Dilling enter the shop, face flushed and brow furrowed. He paused when he saw her, as if weighing whether to speak. "Mr. Dilling," she said softly, "I hear you have had a difficult time these past days." He nodded, avoiding her gaze. "Yes, Miss Marple. It's all been very unsettling. I keep wondering if I could have done something. If I should have said something." She smiled kindly. "Sometimes the smallest observation can make the greatest difference. Keep your eyes open." He looked as if he wanted to say more, but thought better of it and left quickly. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple set the letter from Craddock beside her knitting and took out the envelope she had found near the potting shed. Leonard's name was scrawled in uneven letters, almost childlike. She carefully unfolded the paper within. It was a letter, written in a hurried hand. "My dearest Gwendolen, there are things you do not understand about this village, secrets that must be kept at all costs. I fear for your safety and my own. Trust no one, not even those you call friends. Yours always, L." Miss Marple folded the letter with great care and set it aside, a shadow crossing her face. There was more beneath the surface of this village than the polite smiles and trimmed hedges suggested. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock called upon Miss Marple at her cottage. He was accompanied by a small visitor, a woman whose poise and cool gaze marked her as someone accustomed to scrutiny, Gwendolen Cargill. The widow entered with a measured grace, acknowledging Miss Marple with a slight nod before settling in the chair offered to her. Inspector Craddock began gently. "Mrs. Cargill, we understand you had some interactions with Mr. Taverner on the day of his death. Could you tell us about that?" Gwendolen's lips pressed together before she spoke, in a voice as smooth as silk but edged with steel. "Mr. Taverner was persistent. He insisted on discussing matters I found both painful and private. I requested he leave me alone. We disagreed. That is all." "And the argument at the post office?" Miss Marple asked softly. Gwendolen's eyes flickered briefly toward the inspector, but she answered, "It was a misunderstanding. Nothing more." Miss Marple noted the quickness of her response, as if to shut the topic down, and the slight twitch in her fingers as they clasped and unclasped on her lap. Craddock pressed on. "Did Mr. Taverner have any enemies that you know of?" Gwendolen gave a faint smile. "In a village such as this, who does not?" After the interview, Craddock excused himself, leaving Miss Marple alone with Gwendolen. The widow regarded her with a measured curiosity. "You seem quite interested in my affairs, Miss Marple," she said with a faint edge. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "I am interested in the truth, Mrs. Cargill, and the truth often hides behind those affairs." Gwendolen's expression hardened. "I am a widow now. I expect to be treated with respect." "And you shall be," said Miss Marple. "But respect and truth do not always walk hand in hand." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Arthur Dilling, summoned by the inspector. He entered the room, looking pale and anxious. Gwendolen's gaze flickered to him briefly before she turned back to Miss Marple. "Arthur, perhaps you should explain your relationship with Mr. Taverner." Arthur swallowed nervously. I don't know what Mrs. Cargill means. I only ever wanted to help him. Mr. Taverner was always full of stories about the village, things he had seen or heard. I thought maybe some of it could be used to help me in my work." Miss Marple watched him carefully. There was sincerity in his voice, but also an edge of desperation. "Did you see or hear anything unusual on the day Mr. Taverner died?" Arthur hesitated. "There was someone else at the shed that morning. I didn't get a good look, just a shadow, but it was enough to make me uneasy." Miss Marple's fingers twitched. A shadow, a fleeting presence, something unseen by all but one, the inspector interjected. "We will need to follow up on that, Mr. Dilling, and Mrs. Cargill, your movements that morning." Gwendolen's composure did not falter. "I was at the vicarage, preparing for the garden party. Many people saw me." "Then you might confirm that?" Craddock asked. She smiled thinly. "I have no wish to be anyone's alibi, but I am willing to cooperate." After the visitors had gone, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, hands folded in her lap. The pieces were slowly coming together, but the picture was still incomplete. A letter warning of danger, a secret argument, a mysterious shadow at the scene, and a widow who wore no black but carried a past as heavy as any mourning veil. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the window pane, as if the village itself was shedding tears for what had been lost, and for what was yet to be revealed. The morning that followed brought a thin, persistent drizzle to St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village and lending an air of melancholy to its tidy streets and blooming gardens. Miss Marple stood by the window of her sitting room, the scent of damp earth drifting in as she pondered the tangled web that had begun to emerge. The letter from Leonard, the furtive shadow Arthur Dilling had glimpsed, and the carefully maintained facade of Gwendolen Cargill, all threads woven tightly together, yet no clear pattern visible. As the rain tapped rhythmically on the panes, the doorbell chimed gently, breaking Miss Marple's reverie. She opened the door to find Jane Marple's niece, Lucy Iles-Barrow, clutching a small leather-bound notebook and wearing the air of someone ready for battle. "Good morning, Aunt Jane," Lucy said briskly, stepping inside and shedding her damp coat. "I thought it best to come by and offer my help. Between the village whispers and the official investigation, it's easy to miss things." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You're just in time, Lucy. There is much to consider, and every observation counts." They sat together, and Lucy pulled out her notebook. "I've made some notes after speaking to a few villagers this morning. Everyone's eager to talk, but their stories don't always line up." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Take Mr. Ernest Bramley, for example," Lucy began. "He was near the churchyard the evening of the garden party. He mentioned seeing Leonard arguing with someone, but he couldn't say who. He also said Leonard seemed nervous, almost frightened." "That is an interesting detail," Miss Marple remarked. "Fear often speaks louder than words." Lucy flipped a page. "Then there's Mrs. Gibbons, who runs the village bakery. She overheard Gwendolen on the phone late at night saying, 'It can't happen again.' She didn't catch to whom she was speaking, but it suggests there are troubles beneath the surface." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind raced. "Troubles indeed. And what of Arthur Dilling? Has he said anything new?" Lucy hesitated. "Not much, but I caught him watching the post office closely this morning as if expecting someone." Miss Marple poured tea and handed Lucy a cup. "The post office, yes. A place where news and secrets travel quickly. Perhaps Mr. Taverner's missing letter is linked to that." The day wore on, and as the rain eased, Miss Marple and Lucy made their way toward the post office. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with whispered speculation. Mr. Digby, the postmaster, greeted them with a wary glance. "Miss Marple, Miss Iles-Barrow," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Not much new here, I'm afraid, but I did notice Mr. Taverner had been receiving a number of letters recently, some from London, others from an unknown sender. Did you see any unusual activity around the time of his death?" Miss Marple asked gently. Digby rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, the day before, a woman came by to collect some mail for him, said she was a friend. I didn't recognize her, but she seemed anxious." Lucy exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "Did she leave any name or address?" "No, I'm afraid not, but she mentioned meeting Mr. Taverner near the old mill. The old mill, long abandoned and a favourite spot for village children to dare one another to explore, now held a darker significance." Miss Marple thanked Mr. Digby and stepped outside with Lucy. "The mill is a place of secrets, not only for children's games but for adults' dealings," she murmured. As they walked toward the edge of the village, the clouds parted briefly, allowing shafts of pale sunlight to illuminate the path. The mill loomed ahead, its weathered timbers sagging and stained with years of neglect. They paused at the gate, peering inside, The overgrown courtyard was scattered with rusted machinery and broken windows. Somewhere in that shadowed ruin, clues lay hidden, silent witnesses to whatever had transpired. Lucy shivered slightly. It feels like the past is reaching out to grab this village, Aunt Jane. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sometimes, dear Lucy, the past is the key to understanding the present. Their exploration was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Inspector Craddock, accompanied by a young constable carrying a small parcel. Craddock greeted them with a brisk nod. "We've recovered this from the mill," he said, handing the parcel to Miss Marple. "It was hidden beneath some loose boards near the entrance. We think it belonged to Leonard Taverner." Miss Marple carefully unwrapped the parcel, revealing a worn leather satchel. Inside were several letters, a small notebook, and a photograph faded with time. She pulled out the photograph. It showed Leonard standing beside a younger woman, her face partly obscured by shadow, but the resemblance to Gwendolen was unmistakable. "Who is this?" Lucy asked softly. "An old friend, or perhaps something more," Miss Marple replied, eyes narrowing. "And these letters," she added, scanning the faded script, "speak of debts owed, promises broken, and threats made." Inspector Craddock frowned. "It appears Leonard was tangled in a web far more complicated than anyone suspected." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And it would seem that someone wanted those secrets kept hidden." The inspector glanced at the ruined mill, then back at the women. "We need to speak with Mrs. Cargill again." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple accompanied Craddock to Gwendolen's cottage. The widow answered the door with the same composed grace as before, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of apprehension. "Mrs. Cargill, we found these at the mill," Craddock said, showing her the photograph and letters. "Care to explain your connection to Leonard Taverner?" Gwendolen's lips tightened. "I had no knowledge of those letters, or that photograph. Leonard and I parted ways long ago." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Long ago or recently, Mrs. Cargill. People seldom part entirely when debts and promises linger." Gwendolen's hand trembled for a moment, then steadied. "I will cooperate fully, but I ask that you be mindful of my reputation." "We understand," Craddock said, though his tone was skeptical. After they left, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching Gwendolen close the curtains. The shadows lengthened across the garden as the sun dipped lower, and Miss Marple's mind turned over the revelations of the day. The widow who never wore black was hiding more than grief. She was hiding a past that could destroy lives. And somewhere, in the folds of those faded letters and whispered threats, lay the motive for murder. As dusk settled, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth to surface from the tangled web of secrets beneath its serene exterior. The next morning, a delicate haze hung over St. Mary Mead, softening the familiar outlines of cottages and hedgerows, as if the village itself was reluctant to face the unfolding turmoil. Miss Marple, seated by the window with a fresh cup of tea, reflected on the previous day's discoveries. The photograph, the letters, and Gwendolen's unease painted a more intricate picture than she had first imagined. Yet there remained a detail nagging at her, elusive but persistent, a small fragment that did not quite fit. Before the village stirred fully, there was a knock at the door. Lucy Iles-Barrow, already dressed in a neat coat, entered with brisk energy. "Aunt Jane, I spoke to Mrs. Emmeline Japp this morning. She's been going through the local records and has uncovered something peculiar about Leonard Taverner's financial history." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Financial matters often reveal more than mere numbers, dear. What did Mrs. Japp find?" Lucy spread out a few photocopied pages from the village archive on the small table. "It appears Leonard had recently taken out a sizable loan secured against property that, by all accounts, he didn't own outright. The paperwork is confusing, but there are references to a secret agreement with someone named R. Cargill." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "R. Cargill. Could that be a relative of Gwendolyn's? That was my thought as well, Lucy replied. There's a Richard Cargill listed in the village directory, a distant cousin it seems, though not one who frequents social events. Miss Marple rose thoughtfully, moving toward the mantel where a small brass bell sat. She rang it, and moments later, the soft footsteps of Mrs. Dolly Bantry echoed in the hallway. "Good morning, Dolly. I wonder if you could help me with a small matter." Mrs. Bantry, ever obliging, entered, smoothing the fabric of her apron. "Of course, Jane. What do you need?" "We need to find Richard Cargill. Do you know where he might be?" The village directory gives little more than a name. Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Richard Cargill?" "Yes. I believe he's been staying at the old Cargill estate for a few months. It's just on the outskirts near the woods. He's a quiet sort, not much of a talker." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Then we shall pay him a visit." Later that morning, Miss Marple, Lucy, and Mrs. Bantry set off toward the old Cargill estate. The path wound through damp earth and tangled undergrowth, the trees whispering secrets as a gentle breeze rustled their leaves. The house, once a stately manor, had fallen into disrepair. Ivy clung to crumbling brickwork, and the windows were clouded with grime. They knocked, and after a pause, a man in his early 50s answered. He was tall and lean, with sharp eyes that flickered with guarded curiosity. "Mr. Cargill, I presume," Miss Marple said gently. He nodded curtly. "Yes, and you are?" "Jane Marple from the village. We've come about Leonard Taverner." Richard's face tightened, the briefest shadow crossing his features. "I knew Leonard. Business associate, nothing more." Miss Marple regarded him kindly but steadily. "We understand there was a financial arrangement between you. Might you explain it?" Richard hesitated, then gestured them inside. The interior was dim but orderly, with a faint scent of tobacco and old paper. He motioned for them to sit. "The loan you mentioned," he began, voice low, "was to cover debts Leonard had accrued. There were complications, agreements made in confidence, disputes over property rights. Leonard was desperate to clear his name and secure his family's future." Lucy leaned forward. "Did these disputes lead to any threats or confrontations?" Richard's jaw clenched. "Not from me. But Leonard was involved with others who might not have been as forgiving." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Forgiveness is a luxury seldom extended where money is concerned." Richard exhaled slowly. "There was talk of blackmail, yes. Leonard received letters demanding payment or silence. I assumed it was from a disgruntled creditor, but now I'm not so certain." The room grew quiet, heavy with unspoken fears. "Did Leonard confide in you about anyone in particular?" Miss Marple pressed. "No names. He was cautious, always watching his back." As they left, the weight of Richard's guarded words lingered. Miss Marple's mind turned to the others. Gwendolyn, the mysterious woman who collected Leonard's, mail, and now Richard, shadowed by secrets of his own. Returning to the village, they stopped by the village inn, where whispers of the case bubbled beneath polite conversations. At the counter, Lucy spotted Mr. Ernest Bramley, the man who had seen Leonard arguing the night of the garden party. "Ernest," Lucy called gently, "might we have a word?" He nodded, his face lined with worry. "Anything to help, Miss Islesbarrow." "Did Leonard mention anything about blackmail or threats when you saw him?" Ernest shook his head. "No, but he was tense, more than usual, and the person he argued with was no friend. I'm sure of that." "Can you describe the other man?" Miss Marple asked. "Tall, with a sharp voice. I never got close enough to see his face." The pieces of the puzzle shifted. A man with a sharp voice, secret letters, and a shadowy figure at the mill. The threads were tangled, but Miss Marple's steady mind began to weave them together. That evening, as the village settled beneath a sky smeared with stars, Miss Marple sat quietly, turning over the day's revelations. The quiet man at the estate, the unseen woman at the post office, the anonymous letters, all pointed toward a network of concealed truths and hidden fears. And somewhere in that web, the murderer waited, confident their secrets were safe. Miss Marple sipped her tea, thoughtfully. "Secrets," she murmured, "are like weeds. They thrive in the dark and choke the life from the most unlikely places." Tomorrow would bring new questions, and perhaps the key to unraveling this deadly mystery. But for now, the village lay silent, its breath held tight in anticipation. The morning sun filtered softly through the curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting long shadows that stretched across the worn carpet like silent witnesses to the village's unfolding drama. Jane sat at her writing desk, a fresh sheet of paper before her, but her thoughts were far from her usual correspondence. The events of the past days, the whispered fears, the concealed truths, clung to her mind like a mist, refusing to dissipate. As she pondered, the doorbell chimed unexpectedly. It was Lucy Eilers-Barrow, her expression marked with urgency and something close to unease. "Aunt Jane, you won't believe what I've just heard," she said breathlessly, stepping inside. "Sit down, Lucy. Tell me everything," Miss Marple urged gently, pouring tea for her niece. Lucy settled into the armchair, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her scarf. "I was speaking with Mr. Ernest Bramley again. You know, the man who saw Leonard arguing that night? Well, it seems he spoke with Mrs. Grace Willoughby this morning." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with interest. "Grace Willoughby? The widow who never wore black?" "Yes. Apparently she had a heated discussion with Leonard 2 days before the garden party. Did Mr. Bramley overhear what it was about?" Lucy shook her head. "No, but Mrs. Willoughby was said to be quite distressed afterward. The rumours are starting to circulate now. Some say Leonard had threatened to expose a secret that would ruin Grace's reputation." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly on the table. "Secrets have a way of unravelling when least expected, don't they?" Before Lucy could reply, a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Dolly Bantry entered, carrying a small bundle of letters and documents. "I thought you might find these helpful, Jane," she said, setting the papers down. "Some neighbours have been kind enough to share old correspondences and notes about Leonard's affairs." Miss Marple took the papers with gratitude, scanning the familiar handwriting and legal jargon. These could indeed shed light on the tangled relations in St. Mary Mead. As they examined the letters, one document caught Miss Marple's attention. Letter from Leonard to an anonymous recipient, dated just a week before his death. The words were formal but desperate, pleading for a delay in demands and hinting at a meeting that would clarify their misunderstandings. Lucy leaned over to read. "Could this meeting be the argument Mr. Bramley witnessed?" "It's quite possible," Miss Marple murmured. "But who was Leonard corresponding with? The letter offers no name, only initials, R.C. Lucy's eyes widened. "Richard Cargill. Again?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "His involvement seems more pivotal than we first imagined." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the window. They turned to see Gwendolen Lee standing on the doorstep, looking hesitant but resolute. Miss Marple opened the door. "Gwendolen, do come in," she said kindly. "You seem troubled." Gwendolen stepped inside, folding her hands tightly. "I have something to tell you. Something I should have said earlier." Miss Marple gestured toward a chair. "Please sit. We are listening." Gwendolen's voice was low and shaky. "Leonard. He wasn't the man everyone thought. He kept parts of himself hidden, even from me. That night of the garden party, before the tragedy, I overheard him speaking on the phone. He was terrified." "Terrified of what?" Lucy asked gently. Gwendolen swallowed hard. "He spoke of a person who threatened to expose him if he didn't comply with certain demands. He never named the person, but he said the consequences would be devastating, not just for him, but for those he cared about. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Did Leonard mention any place or event connected to these threats? He mentioned the mill, Gwendolen said quietly. The old mill at the edge of the village. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling heavily among them. Miss Marple stood, moving toward the window that overlooked the village. The mill has long been a place of whispered stories. Perhaps it is time we paid it a visit. Lucy and Dolly exchanged glances, then followed as Miss Marple stepped out into the cool morning air. The path to the mill was narrow and overgrown, the scent of damp earth and wildflowers thick in the air. The old wooden doors creaked ominously as they pushed inside. The interior was shadowed, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. Broken machinery and scattered tools suggested the building had been abandoned for years, yet Miss Marple's keen eyes noticed fresh footprints in the dirt, a sign that someone had been there recently. As they explored, a sudden movement caught Lucy's attention. "Look there," she whispered, pointing to a small bundle tucked beneath a rafter. Miss Marple retrieved it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper, stained and creased but legible. It was a note. "Meet me at midnight. Come alone, or all will be revealed." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. A clandestine meeting, then. Someone intended to confront Leonard in secret. Lucy asked, "Could the note be from the blackmailer?" "Very likely," Miss Marple replied. "But who would arrange such a meeting in this forgotten place, in the dead of night?" As they left the mill, the questions multiplied. Who was the shadowy figure forcing Leonard's hand? Why was the mill chosen as a meeting place? And could this person have been the one to end Leonard's life? Returning to the village, Miss Marple felt the familiar stirrings of a puzzle coming together, though many pieces remained missing. She decided it was time to speak with the village constable, Mr. Harcourt, to see what further information might be uncovered. In the quiet of the police office, Miss Marple presented the new findings: the loan, the anonymous threats, the note, and the secret meetings. Constable Harcourt listened attentively, his brows furrowing with concern. "Miss Marple, this changes the picture considerably. We had begun to think Leonard's death was a tragic accident, or a simple crime of passion. But it seems there's something more calculating at work." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "I believe the murderer is someone deeply entwined in these financial disputes and personal vendettas." Harcourt nodded slowly. "We'll increase patrols near the mill and interview anyone who might have been seen around there recently." Miss Marple left the station. The sun dipped behind a bank of clouds, casting a grey pall over St. Mary Mead. The village felt fragile, poised on the edge of revelation or ruin. That evening, as twilight deepened and windows glowed softly with lamplight, Miss Marple sat in contemplation. Her thoughts turned again to Gwendolen, the woman who had hidden so much, and Richard Cargill, whose silence was growing heavier. Somewhere in the shadows of the village lay a truth, carefully guarded and deadly, and Miss Marple, with her quiet determination and gentle insight, was closing in. The morning after her visit to the mill, Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to the rhythms of village life, though beneath the surface the currents of suspicion and anxiety swirled ever stronger. The flowers in her garden nodded gently in the breeze, as if whispering secrets only she could hear. She had spent the early hours reviewing her notes and letters, allowing her mind to sift through the tangled threads of evidence and human frailty. When the post arrived, among the usual letters and bills was a small, neatly folded envelope with no return address. With a faint sense of foreboding, she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, written in a hurried scrawl. "Beware the one who smiles too sweetly. All is not as it seems." No signature, no indication of sender. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket, quiet, but clear message that the shadows she was chasing had noticed her pursuit. Later that morning, she walked to the village square, a favourite spot where gossip and news often bloomed as readily as the spring flowers. At the bakery she found Mrs. Lettice Barrow, the village's most enthusiastic chronicler of other people's affairs, poring over a cup of tea and speaking with an air of urgency. "Good morning, Lettice," Miss Marple greeted, smiling warmly. "What news do you have for me today?" "Oh, Jane, it's quite the stir. You won't believe what's being said about Richard Cargill. Some say he was seen in a very heated discussion with Grace Willoughby just yesterday afternoon," Lettice whispered conspiratorially. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Indeed. That seems consistent with some of the threads I've been unraveling. Tell me, what was the nature of their disagreement, do you know?" Lettice shrugged, eyes bright with the thrill of scandal. "Nobody quite knows, but there's talk that it might have been about Leonard's affairs. Financial, of course. Some say Richard wanted a share of something Leonard was withholding." Miss Marple's mind raced. The initials R.C. on the letter, Richard's connection to Leonard, the heated arguments. They were beginning to paint a picture more complex than she had initially suspected. But there was something else, an unspoken tension in the air, a discomfort that lingered when these names were mentioned. As she walked back home, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Gwendolen Lee's revelation about Leonard's fear of exposure and the secret meeting at the mill. She wondered if Richard Cargill might have been the person behind the threats, or at least involved in that shadowy game. Yet Richard was known in the village as a man of genteel manners and solid reputation, though, as always, appearances could deceive. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a surprise visitor, Richard himself. His knock was firm but respectful. She invited him in, curious to observe the man who had become such a central figure in her investigation. Richard entered with a composed smile, though there was a faint tension in his eyes. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding," he said, politely. "Not at all, Mr. Cargill. Please have a seat. I was hoping we might talk," she replied, gesturing to the comfortable chairs by the fire. Richard settled in, folding his hands. "I understand there's quite a bit of talk around the village regarding Leonard's death and my name being mentioned. I assure you, I had nothing to do with it." Miss Marple regarded him carefully, noting the subtle way his fingers tapped on the armrest. "I find that people often reveal more by what they choose not to say, Mr. Cargill. Tell me, how well did you know Leonard?" "We were acquaintances, business associates at best. Leonard was a complicated man, charming when it suited him, but prone to keeping secrets. I believe those secrets may have been his downfall." "Secrets often have a way of surfacing, don't they? Especially when tied to money and pride," Miss Marple mused. "Did you have any recent disagreements with Leonard?" Richard hesitated, then admitted. "There were discussions, some heated, over a loan Leonard had taken from my family's estate. He was late in repaying, and tensions arose, but I never threatened him, nor did I wish him harm." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "One wonders, then, who would go to such lengths as to threaten and ultimately kill him?" Before Richard could respond, a sharp rap came at the door. It was Constable Harcourt, looking troubled. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been an incident at the village hall," Harcourt announced. "Another piece of evidence has turned up, something that could change the entire course of our investigation." Miss Marple and Richard exchanged glances as they followed the constable to the scene. At the village hall, a small crowd had gathered. Harcourt cleared the way, revealing a desk overturned and papers scattered across the floor. But what drew everyone's attention was a leather-bound diary lying open on the desk, its pages soaked with spilled tea, yet still legible. "It was found by the caretaker early this morning," Harcourt explained. "The diary belonged to Leonard, It contains entries that suggest he knew more about the villagers' secrets than anyone suspected. Miss Marple knelt beside the diary, scanning the entries. The handwriting was neat, but tense, the words revealing a man desperate to protect himself from threats both financial and personal. One passage caught her eye. April 12th. Met with Gwendolen. She does not suspect the danger. If only she knew what I carry on my conscience. The debt to RC weighs heavy, but the real threat is closer than I thought. Her gaze lifted to meet Gwendolen's, who stood quietly in the corner, eyes downcast. Another. Entry read April 15th, received a message tonight. The mill. Alone. No witnesses. I fear this meeting will decide more than just my fate. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the urgency of Leonard's last days. The diary was a testament to the fear and desperation that had gripped him, but also a confession that someone very near to him might be involved in his downfall. She stood, addressing the gathering. This diary confirms that Leonard was coerced, frightened, and caught in a web of secrets, but it also suggests the involvement of someone from within this community. Richard's jaw tightened. But who among us would resort to murder? Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, landing on a figure standing slightly apart, Mrs. Grace Willoughby. Her face was a mask of polite concern, but Miss Marple noticed the faintest flicker of apprehension in her eyes. Mrs. Willoughby, might I speak with you privately? Miss Marple asked softly. Grace nodded and followed her to a quieter corner. Grace, Leonard's diary mentions a meeting with Gwendolen and a debt to RC, but also hints at a threat closer than he expected. Can you tell me more about your relationship with Leonard? Grace's composure faltered briefly before she replied. Leonard and I shared a complicated past. We were close once, but things changed. He threatened to reveal matters that would ruin me socially. I feared losing everything. Did Leonard give you reason to believe he would expose these secrets? Miss Marple pressed gently. Grace's eyes filled with tears. He did, but I never wanted him harmed. I only wished for him to be quiet. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes fear leads us to make decisions we later regret. It seems many here had motives, but few the courage to act. As Grace returned to the group, Miss Marple's attention shifted to Gwendolen and Richard. The pieces were slowly assembling, alliances, betrayals, hidden fears, but the full picture remained just out of reach. Later that evening, back in the comfort of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, diary and notes spread before her. She had learned much that day, of threats whispered in shadow, of debts unpaid, of secrets wrapped in smiles. Her mind was already working on the next step. There was a subtle pattern in the villagers' behavior, a delicate balance between truth and deception that only she could navigate. Somewhere among them was a killer, masked by civility and driven by desperation, and Miss Marple knew that to find the truth, she must watch closely, listen carefully, and wait for the moment when the smallest slip would reveal the greatest secret. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, the sun casting long shadows across the village green, as if hinting at secrets still concealed in the lingering chill. Miss Marple, dressed in her customary neat attire, stepped out of her cottage with a sense of quiet determination. The events of the previous days had stirred the usually tranquil village into a restless state, yet she remained undisturbed by the murmur of speculation. Her first call was to Gwendolen Lee, who had requested to meet with her privately. At Gwendolen's modest home near the edge of the village, Miss Marple was greeted with a nervous smile and a palpable tension in the air. "Thank you for seeing me, Miss Marple," Gwendolen said softly as she led her into the sitting room. The room was modest but neat, with lace curtains and a small vase of freshly picked wildflowers on the table. "I thought it best we spoke without distractions," Gwendolen began, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is more to Leonard's story than I have yet shared." Miss Marple inclined her head, signaling for her to continue. "I did not tell you about the last time I saw Leonard," Gwendolen said, her hands twisting the edge of a cushion. "It was the evening before his death, late after dinner. He came to my home in a great state of agitation. He was clutching a letter, one I have never seen, and he begged me to keep it safe. Said it contained something important, something that would change everything." "And what became of this letter?" Miss Marple asked gently. Gwendolen shook her head. "I was frightened, and I hid it away in a drawer in my bedroom. I thought I was protecting myself, and perhaps Leonard as well. I have not looked at it since that night." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Would you mind if I saw this letter?" Gwendolen hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Of course. It is locked in my writing desk. I will fetch it." She returned moments later with a small, ornate box. Inside lay an envelope, yellowed at the edges. Miss Marple carefully unfolded the letter, reading the neat handwriting that was unmistakably Leonard's. The letter was a brief but urgent warning addressed to an unnamed individual. It spoke of dangers, of secrets that could ruin reputations and livelihoods, and of a meeting scheduled at the mill, an appointment Leonard hoped would bring resolution, but feared might bring disaster instead. Miss Marple's mind raced. This letter was a vital piece of the puzzle, proof that Leonard was trying to expose or confront someone. But who was the recipient? As she carefully replaced the letter, a sudden noise startled them. The sound of hurried footsteps approached the door, followed by a sharp knock. Gwendolen paled. "It's Mrs. Willoughby," she whispered. Miss Marple opened the door to reveal Grace Willoughby standing just beyond the threshold, her expression cautious but composed. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Grace said, inclining her head politely. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied smoothly. "Come in, Grace. We were just reviewing some of Leonard's correspondence." Grace's eyes flickered toward the letter in Gwendolen's hands, then away. "I thought it best we speak openly. There are matters that need to be addressed, and I believe secrecy will only deepen the wounds." Miss Marple gestured to the chairs, inviting Grace to join them. "I have been reflecting on Leonard's death and the tensions it has unleashed," Grace began, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "There are things you do not know, things about Leonard's dealings, his true nature." Gwendolen shifted uncomfortably. "Grace, what are you implying?" "That Leonard was not the man we thought him to be," Grace said quietly. "His charm masked debts, betrayals, and threats that stretched beyond this village." Miss Marple observed the two women carefully. It was clear that their shared history was tangled with more than just friendship or rivalry. There was fear, guilt, and something deeper, a fracture that perhaps Leonard had exploited. Before either could respond, the sound of voices and footsteps drew near. Miss Marple rose to greet Constable Harcourt, who arrived with a purposeful stride. "Miss Marple, I've just received word from the forensics team," he said, offering a slight bow. "They found something at the mill, something that could shed light on the circumstances of Leonard's death." The three women exchanged glances, the tension in the room thickening. "I thought it best you knew immediately," Harcourt continued. "If you will come with me." They made their way together to the old mill, its weathered stones bathed in the morning light. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Near the back entrance, the forensic officer handed Harcourt a small, carefully sealed evidence bag. "Found this lodged beneath the floorboards where the body was discovered," Harcourt explained. "A handkerchief. Not just any handkerchief, embroidered with the initials GW." Miss Marple's gaze flickered to Grace, who had suddenly gone pale. "Grace, could you tell me if you own such a handkerchief?" Miss Marple asked softly. Grace swallowed hard. I I do. It's a family heirloom. I lost it recently, though I did not realize until now. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the implications. If the handkerchief was at the scene, it could mean many things. Perhaps Grace was there, or perhaps someone had planted it. "Have you been to the mill recently?" Miss Marple inquired. Grace hesitated. "I was there the day before Leonard's death to confront him. We argued, but I left before nightfall." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did anyone see you?" "No, I was alone. But I swear I did. Not harm Leonard." Harcourt took a careful note of her statement. As they walked away from the mill, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate dance of trust and deception unfolding before her. The handkerchief was a crucial clue, yet it did not alone prove guilt. It was the reactions, the small slips in behavior, that would unravel the truth. Later that day, Miss Marple gathered the key villagers in the drawing room of her cottage under the pretext of discussing the diary and recent findings. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She addressed the room calmly. "The events surrounding Leonard's death are tangled with long-held secrets and hidden fears. Each of you has been touched by his presence, his decisions, and his mistakes. Yet, in these shadows lie the truths we must bring to light." Eyes shifted uneasily as she spoke. "I believe the next step is to observe more closely how each of you responds to certain revelations. There are truths that emerge only when one feels safe enough or threatened enough to reveal them." Gwendolen looked at Grace with a mixture of suspicion and pity. Richard, who had also joined the gathering, seemed guarded, his jaw clenched. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on each face, noting the subtle exchanges, the fleeting glance, the tightened lips, the restless hands. The widow who never wore black had kept many secrets, and as the pieces fell into place, Miss Marple prepared for the delicate task of bringing them all to light. The game was nearing its climax, and the village held its breath, unaware that the gentle woman in the corner, with her keen eyes and gentle smile, was already several steps ahead. The morning mist clung softly to the village as Miss Marple set out for her habitual stroll through the lanes of St. Mary Mead, the cobblestones, slick beneath her sensible shoes. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of damp earth and blooming honeysuckle. There was an unspoken stillness in the village now, a fragile calm that belied the turmoil simmering just beneath the surface. The day before, Miss Marple had gathered a small group of villagers at the vicarage for tea, a gathering that had been quietly charged with subtle questions and measured answers. Today, her thoughts circled relentlessly around the threads she had collected, weaving them into a pattern that had yet to reveal its final shape. She paused at the corner by the old churchyard, her gaze drifting to the weathered tombstones. The village had witnessed its share of tragedies, but this one was different, closer, more personal. Leonard's death was no accident, and though the police had their theories, Miss Marple sensed the truth was more intricate than a single motive or a solitary culprit. As she walked toward the village green, she spotted Grace Willoughby seated on a bench near the old oak tree. The widow looked pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on some distant point. Miss Marple approached quietly, not wishing to startle her. "Good morning, Grace," she said softly, settling beside her. "The air feels heavier today, doesn't it?" Grace looked up, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "Yes, it does. I can hardly believe how much has changed in such a short time. I keep wondering if I might have missed something, some sign." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Sometimes the signs are there, but they don't reveal themselves until we look in a different light." Grace's voice trembled slightly. "I keep thinking about the night Leonard died, the argument they say we had. It was nothing like that. Yes, we disagreed, but I never imagined it would lead to such a tragedy. The widow's vulnerability was laid bare, but Miss Marple was no stranger to the mask's grief war. People say things in anger they don't mean, Grace. What matters is what lies beneath those words. Grace looked down, fingers trembling. There was something else. Leonard received a letter just before, something he wanted to keep secret. He told me it was important, that it could change everything. But I never saw it. Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. Do you know who sent the letter? Grace hesitated. No, he was very guarded about it. But now I fear it might have held the key to what happened. They sat in silence a moment, the weight of the unspoken pressing between them. Then Grace looked up, eyes searching. Miss Marple, I don't know whom to trust anymore. Before Miss Marple could answer, footsteps approached. It was Inspector Graves, his expression grave but respectful. Miss Willoughby, he said, nodding politely. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Inspector, Grace replied, though the tension in her voice was evident. Graves turned to Miss Marple. I thought it best to update you on the latest. We found something at the mill, a scrap of paper tucked away near the machinery. It appears to be part of a letter, torn, but the handwriting is familiar. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Do you have it with you? Graves produced a small, folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, unfolding it carefully. The writing was hurried, some words obscured by smudges, but the phrase, cannot be trusted. Will pay dearly, was clear. Do you recognize the handwriting? Graves asked. Miss Marple glanced closely. It resembles Leonard's, but with a different flair. It might be someone who knew him well, someone trying to send a warning. Grace gasped softly. That could be the letter he was hiding. He said someone was threatening him. I never thought it would come to this. Graves folded the paper carefully. This changes the picture somewhat. We must consider that Leonard's death was not simply the result of a personal quarrel. Miss Marple agreed. Yes, Inspector. It seems the roots run deeper. We must look closely at those who might benefit from his silence. The trio fell into thoughtful silence as the village began to stir with the usual sounds of daily life, the distant clatter of carts and the murmur of early shoppers. But beneath the normalcy, suspicion and fear had taken hold. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the home of Mrs. Penelope Cartwright. The widow was waiting in her drawing room, a shawl draped about her shoulders, eyes sharp despite the lines of age. Miss Marple, I'm glad you came, Penelope said, her voice steady. I have been thinking about Leonard's debts and the diary. There are mentions of old grievances, disputes over land and money, but also more personal matters. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Such as? Penelope hesitated, then spoke in a low tone. There was talk of a relationship between Leonard and someone in the village, something secret, possibly scandalous. It might explain the vehemence of his enemies. Miss Marple's mind raced. The village, with all its quaint charm, was a tinderbox of hidden resentments and fragile reputations. Do you have the diary with you? Miss Marple asked. Penelope nodded. I managed to retrieve it from the safe, but I fear parts are missing. They examined the leather-bound volume. Together, pages yellowed with age. Certain entries were cryptic, referring to meetings under the old bridge and a promise broken. The handwriting shifted between neat and frantic, reflecting the turmoil within Leonard's mind. Suddenly, a passage caught Miss Marple's attention. Trust is a fragile thing. Those who break it must be prepared to face the consequences. They read. Footsteps approached outside, and a voice called softly. It was Richard Lawson. Miss Marple, Mrs. Cartwright, he said, stepping inside with a grave expression. I've been to see Thomas Everett. He's growing anxious, and I fear for what might happen next. Miss Marple looked up sharply. What do you mean? Everett was seen arguing with Leonard recently. more heated than anyone knew. And now, after the burglary, he's become evasive when questioned. Penelope frowned. He denies involvement, but his behavior is suspicious. Miss Marple stood, her resolve firming. We are close to the heart of the matter, I believe. It is time to confront these shadows directly. That evening, Miss Marple arranged a discreet meeting at the vicarage, inviting Graves, Harcourt, Grace, Richard, and Mrs. Cartwright. The small room was thick with anticipation, as Miss Marple spoke gently, but with authority. We have seen that. Leonard's death was the result of more than a simple dispute. There are secrets of debts, betrayals, and hidden alliances. But what has emerged most clearly is that the killer is someone desperate to keep these secrets buried. She paused, letting her words settle. I believe the key lies not in what was stolen or destroyed, but in what was said, what was left unsaid, and how each of you reacted when faced with the truth. The assembled group exchanged uneasy glances. Miss Marple continued, There will be one final test. A question I will ask each of you, quietly and in turn. Your answers will reveal more than any piece of evidence. As the night deepened, Miss Marple's calm demeanour masked the storm of thoughts within her. She knew the moment to act was near. The widow who never wore black had long concealed the heart of darkness in this village. But tonight, that darkness would be brought into the light. The vicarage was hushed, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the assembled faces. Miss Marple sat quietly, observing each person with that serene yet penetrating gaze that had unsettled many before them. The moment had come to draw the threads together, to expose the hidden heart of the mystery that had enveloped St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple began softly, Thank you all for coming. These past days have been difficult, and yet, amidst confusion and suspicion, we have glimpsed fragments of truth. It is time to see how they fit. She glanced at Grace Willoughby first, the widow whose grief had been so palpable. Grace, your courage in facing the past is admirable. You spoke of a letter Leonard received, one that held secrets dangerous enough to silence him forever. But this letter, as we discovered, was not from a stranger, but from someone close. Turning toward Richard Lawson, Miss Marple continued, Richard, your presence here today reflects your concern for Leonard's memory, yet your relationship was more complicated than most realized. Richard's eyes flickered with unease, but he remained silent. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly around the room. And then there was Thomas Everett, whose quarrel with Leonard was fierce. Yet his motives seemed transparent, perhaps too transparent. She paused, allowing the tension to build before speaking again. But the true key lay not in the arguments or the debts, nor even in the stolen possessions. It lay in the human art, in jealousy, betrayal, and fear. Miss Marple's voice grew steady. It was you, Penelope Cartwright, who sent the letter. A sharp intake of breath escaped from Penelope, but she said nothing. You feared that Leonard's secrets, once revealed, would destroy your family's standing. You believed that if Leonard's story were told, the scandal would unravel generations of carefully preserved reputation. Penelope's composure cracked slightly, but she raised her chin. I did what I had to do. Miss Marple nodded gently. And in your desperation, you underestimated the consequences. You confronted Leonard at the mill, intending only to warn him. But when he resisted, the situation escalated beyond control. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Penelope. The torn letter found at the mill, Miss Marple continued, was a warning, written in haste and fear. You tried to hide your involvement, but your actions only deepened suspicion. Inspector Graves stepped forward, solemn but resolute. Penelope Cartwright, I must ask you to come with me. Penelope allowed herself to be led away without resistance, a faint smile flickering as if she had expected this all along. As the villagers began to disperse, Miss Marple remained by the window, gazing out at the fading light. The village would never quite be the same. The shadows that had lingered were now exposed, but the fragile peace would endure. Grace came to stand beside her, voice soft. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing what others could not." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "It is always the quiet truths, Grace, hidden in human hearts and small gestures, that tell the real story. And sometimes it takes a gentle eye to see them." With that, the village of St. Mary Mead settled back into its rhythm, the echoes of the past mingling with the promise of tomorrow, as Miss Marple quietly walked home, content that justice and understanding had been served.